I think everybody should start something of their own. It doesn't have to be considered a business, but I think this is something that starting something of your own where you create something and you're trying to sell that in the world, it reflects so much of your own issues back to you that it's such a good process for people to go through.
Yeah, as I mean, the entire conversation, if you were to like extract a sort of meta narrative from this entire thing, it seems like most of what we study about business is numbers and strategy and all of this kind of stuff that sure, it's important and it makes sense. And you and I both do it for a living in different ways. But when it comes to starting your own business and running a business, actually, so many of the potential hazards and avenues for success are like your own mindset.
This is a new and strange environment at first, suddenly finding yourself in orbit.
I'm Neville Andrew Mera, and this is Never Normal, a show about breaking free from the boring default plan and living life on your terms instead. Vikram Seth, welcome back to Never Normal.
Many thanks.
We spoke last time about you leaving your job as a senior economist at Shell, going on sabbatical, and traveling to, I think we covered Dubai, Japan, and India. And we talked a lot about your experience at a 10-day silent, scary, Vipassana meditation retreat in Japan. And then we sort of went off on a track of kind of the philosophy and meditation and touched a bit on crypto. Something I didn't get to ask you last time, a bit more pragmatic, but something I know everybody is wondering. You mentioned that your sabbatical was unpaid, that you left on an unpaid break from work, and it started as a year. How did you fund your life during that time? And how did you even approach thinking about that? I mean, I think for a lot of people, the idea of taking a sabbatical is maybe radical, but even if their company had a sabbatical policy or it was like their boss agreed to it, the idea of not earning an income for a period of time, like a year, is just either infeasible or super scary. How did you approach that?
It was definitely super scary, especially for me, because maybe this is late for some people, but for me, since from the age of 18, I have always had an income and I've never had a lack of money compared to whatever I want to spend the money on. So, and also, I don't know, I think this is like something that comes with being an elder sibling or something, that I always have this sense of like responsibility towards parents and my brother and everything. So one of the ways that manifests, it's like I need to be able to earn to cover myself, because just in case I need to also be able to cover anybody else, I can't be in a position where I myself am lacking. So that's definitely an issue for me. It was definitely a something which was a fear. So firstly, I was saving a lot. My savings were in a good enough place. And I also deliberately did that because I had a period of time where I knew that I'm going to take the sabbatical and I had sort of agreed it, but I still had a few months of work. So, I mean, very practically, I just made it a point to cut down my expenditure and build up more and more savings. I had a decent amount anyway. I didn't necessarily spend a lot of time kind of calculating how much I need for 1 year or 2 years, or if I decide I'm not going back, then and the reason for that was because I was very confident that I want to start something. Like I sort of maybe mentioned last time, like it wasn't necessarily like a concrete plan of what I want to do. I knew I needed a break, but I also had enough confidence in myself that like if I want to do something, then I should be able to do something where I can start either a side business or some sort of income generating thing. And then worst case scenario, and this was again the biggest kind of fallback for me, that worst case scenario, I can call up HR and say, hey, I want to come back to Shell, because the sabbatical, there was no like required minimum. It's your sabbatical. So it's like, if you want to take 3 months, if you want to come back after 2 weeks, fine. Like, you know, it's you're taking it for your own reason. So for sure, I think actually at the beginning I was only intending to do like a few months. We can get into this. I had actually secured a new opportunity, or was securing a new opportunity within Shell to cover me for when I come back, and to make sure that, you know, I can be in the area that I want to be in, etc. So I did have that I did have that sort of at the back of my mind. But the interesting thing was, as the sabbatical sort of progressed, and I think after about 9 months or so, when I realized, oh shit, it's actually kind of hard to earn a lot of money from scratch. Like I was doing a bunch of stuff. I was doing things like coaching, mentoring, running some workshops on meditation and yoga and like almost life coaching type stuff, and they were making money. They were definitely making money, but they were making nowhere near obviously a corporate salary. Bear in mind, I've like just started this out of thin air during the sabbatical. So the interesting thing was my psychology and how that was kind of changing, because I was very far away from running out of money, but my sort of survival instinct had already kicked in, saying, "You idiot! You're killing yourself. Like you're going to like." I probably had about a year's worth of savings left that I could live off, and earn zero money and live off. But for some reason, because it wasn't 2 years worth of savings anymore, like I started feeling this kind of threat that I need to secure something. So that was, I needed to secure like a proper income. And that was very interesting for me to like observe of myself, because as I said, like since the age of 18, I'd never sort of been in that. And before that, I never, just dependent on parents anyway. So this was probably the first time ever that I had faced that sense of survival, that the kind of like just psychologically feeling like I may not get through, even though it sounds ridiculous. Like I had a year's worth of savings, etc. And that reminds me of Elon Musk. And I don't know if, I actually don't know if this story is true or not, but I think it probably is. But Elon Musk somehow was like very aware of this psychological tendency to need security before you actually require the security. Like you need the psychological safety net before you actually need the safety net in reality. And so what he did was, in university, wanted to make sure that he could psychologically deal with living off a very, very low income and convince himself that he doesn't need much money. And so he deliberately would eat only like rice and beans because you can buy them in bulk for extremely cheap. And he basically kept I think he did an experiment where he was keeping his daily expenses below something like $1 or $2, like ridiculously cheap, to prove to himself that he can live off this low income and therefore build and do whatever he wants, which is really interesting, because I was definitely in the opposite space, where I was always earning well beyond what I actually needed, and therefore didn't have that kind of psychological strength around money, but not in a negative way, in the sense of like I hadn't built up that kind of mental fortitude to be able to deal with feeling that lack and working through it, instead of just kind of like caving in and going like, oh shit, I need to get a job now.
So many good bits in there that I want to dive into. I'm like furiously scribbling little notes to make sure I come back to all the little hooks you've thrown me there. I can't resist the obvious one, which is to contrast Elon Musk living that way, I guess it was during his university days, and now being the richest, or kind of perennially floating at the top of the richest people in the world list. So that obviously worked out well for him, that sort of training. And you even preempted my next question, which is a little note that I have here. I'll read it verbatim. It's easy to say I'm going to save money and travel the world, and if you're a high achiever type, it's relatively easy to actually save the money, right? Just have more income than your expenses. The hard part is actually to watch your bank account go down. And I've experienced the exact same thing myself, and it's easy to kind of like look at it now and be like, oh, it's such a first world problem or such a fake thing. It's not real survival, but the psychology of it is true. And if you accept that, if you want to go and do something hard, the only real way you fail is if you quit. And so it's like ensuring that you won't quit becomes the most important way to succeed, especially when we get into the whole infinite games type of thing, right? You just want to keep playing, you want to keep going, you want to prolong your ability to do the thing that you're doing. And if the risk is that you'll pull the plug on it yourself, then you're finding a way to make sure you don't do that becomes really important. And I can totally relate to the psychological side of what you're saying, where you're used to seeing the bank account go up every month, and some part of the story you tell yourself, whether that's in your case your role within the family or just, honestly, it's ego, right? Like I'm the kind of person who's good at work. I'm the kind of person who makes a lot of money. I'm the kind of person who's successful. And when you see your bank account lower each month or debt go up each month, it's like attacking that story, and it's a very difficult primal sort of a fear to contend with. I think you already laid out one of the potential antidotes, and maybe it doesn't even need to be as extreme as the Elon example. I know Tim Ferriss has something very similar that he talks about, which I think actually even goes back to like the ancient Stoics, which is to just have like almost like a ritual practice of, say, once a year living very cheaply. I think he calls it like the scantest of fare and the roughest of clothes or something like that. This might go back to like Seneca or Marcus Aurelius. I'm sure we could look up the quote and put it in the show notes. But the idea is the same, and it's basically to overcome that worst case scenario fear, because for most of us, the worst case scenario and the fear isn't actually, death or like a lion hiding in the bushes, but our brain treats it that way. It's actually just, oh yeah, like I ran out of money and now I need to go look for work again. And in the meantime, I got to really like scrimp and cut back on expenses and maybe borrow money from someone or, rely on a social safety net or something like that. And it's training your brain to realize that, like, while that's not the desired result, fear of that shouldn't outweigh your desire to pursue whatever your goal is.
So you mentioned Stoicism, and I have to bring up there Ryan Holiday, and I mean, just the title of one of his books, The Obstacle is the Way. That is, I think, the learning that I got from this. Exactly what you're saying. So two things there. One is I was presented with an obstacle, and that obstacle was in my own mind, and I had this fork in the road, and the fork in the road was fight the obstacle and get through it. And the other one was run away from and that obstacle was my own mind sort of saying, oh, you're running out of money, you're seeing your bank account go down, find a way through it. And interestingly enough, like I think this is one of those things where people ask questions like, what would you do if you had $1 million? What would you do if you didn't need money, etc.? I actually now don't think that you can truly know the answer to that until you're faced with this scenario. And the reason for that is because I had there was no way I could have known that actually this is how I would react until I was in that situation where I was seeing my bank account go down and where I was questioning, where am I going to be able to, earn from during this period. So it was interesting because that we know how we will react when a certain obstacle comes in front of us, but you really don't know until that happens. And that was a really interesting learning for me. Also, the interesting thing was because I sort of ran away from the obstacle. That is what I did ultimately. Kind of. I mean, I figured out a new way. This is where, the point is like, you don't actually fail until you quit. So I didn't fully quit. I semi-quit maybe, or I found another solution. But my solution wasn't to hit the obstacle head on and just keep going, because in reality, I did have enough savings left and I could have just sort of kept moving forward. Yeah, there's so many things in that. I think the second thing is you brought up Tim Ferriss and, we talked about Elon Musk, also Gary Vaynerchuk, all of these guys. And I think the more you look into it, the more you might find a similar pattern that a lot of these guys and ladies at the top of their game, I think from much of what I've read of them and listened to them, they have actually mastered this in their own mind, which is to live frugally, live well below their means. In fact, I think your dad, there's a specific thing that your dad said to me, and my mum also shared that he used to say this to them as well. But I mean, it's quite a straightforward thing, but like if you've got $10 in your pocket, you don't want to spend. If you spend 11, you're screwed. If you spend 9, you're happy, right? So it's just such a basic concept, but I think that is something which is important for us to consider. How that affects your psychology is something that we don't really think about that much.
Something that comes up often, I have a lot of conversations with people who are either want to become digital nomads or sort of exploring that space, or just even starting businesses, quitting a job. And just like a thing that comes up very often is this idea of like, should you burn your bridges? And talking to you about all of this kind of reminds me that it's unsatisfying, but I don't think there really is an answer. I think it depends on the person because, from what we talked about last time and from what we're getting at here, clearly for you having a certain sense of security was very important. And you gained that sense of security from knowing that you could go back at any point. You were sort of emboldened to leave Shell because you knew you could go back to Shell. Like your sabbatical the whole idea of a sabbatical, right? That you had a job waiting for you at the end. And it's like, worst case scenario, this whole thing blows up in my face, call HR, as you said, and say like, hey guys, I'm back. Whereas for some friends and people I know, it's the exact opposite, that unless something like forces them and they really have no alternative, they won't face some uncomfortable decision. Like they will just avoid it as long as possible or not do the thing that they know they should do until they're just left with no other choice. And I've struggled to give people advice on that because they ask, and it's like, as we talk about it, I'm just realizing that I think it maybe this is one of those ways where like self-awareness is really important, and just sort of understanding what you as a person need. Like, are you the type of person who will always try to maintain security, in which case, having a backup plan is probably good? Or are you the person who will just sort of like always rationalize and procrastinate, in which case, you just need to force yourself, like move to a new city, quit the job, burn the bridge, whatever it is, and then you'll force yourself to figure it out, and you will.
Precisely. And I think, coming back to the point I made before, I think you don't know how, if you don't know how you're going to react, then I think you just need to try one of those two approaches and see how you react. So I didn't even burn my bridge there, but I put it on the side, and just sort of stepping away from the bridge already caused me a lot of mental anguish. So, which is really interesting. So then that learning for me was then, okay, so then I need some sort of a bridge or a crutch to provide myself with a sense of security. But I think you don't know that. So one approach is just try it, just pick one, burn the bridge, see what happens. And if it doesn't work, then and if you sort of react very negatively, then I think you've got a clear answer there that your mental makeup is that you need some sort of a sense of security. And maybe then, so the practical thing for that then maybe is do a side hustle alongside your main earner, for example. Alternatively, like you just start with that anyway. And if you don't enjoy that, or if that doesn't work, or you feel like you're already kind of splitting your mind between too many different things, then maybe the burning of the bridge is. But the other point to make is it's interesting because a number of entrepreneurs, like very successful entrepreneurs who I've sort of listened to and paid attention to, and some who I've spoken with, who have completely burned their bridges in order to start their business and whatever, their advice is that they did a stupid thing, even though they became successful from doing that. And it's really interesting to see this dynamic. They became successful by burning the bridge because they had no other option and they had to go all in on the thing that they were building. But you ask them for advice, their advice will be, I was stupid, such a struggle, do a side hustle, and you shouldn't burn your bridge because it causes a lot of pressure on yourself. It's like, there's another quote, like, why put pressure on your passion? Just let your passion develop. But by revealed preference, they actually did burn their bridge and they became successful. So I don't know where the causality is or anything, but like, it's just interesting to see that on reflection, they're like, no, I screwed myself over. This was too difficult to pass. But that path actually did lead them to success. Survival bias, maybe, as well.
Survival bias, it's very kind of, well, it's like a reverse survivorship bias, though, because like they did survive, but then they're biased towards the approach that they didn't take. In so many things in life, like you want to preserve capital once you have capital. Before you have capital, you're sort of like, I'll take all the risks. And now once they're like built something, they're more risk averse and they're taking today's mindset and putting it on previous version of themselves. I'm very inherently skeptical of people telling you, hey, I did this thing and it worked out well for me, but you should do something different. Right? Like that's just, as a category of advice giving, is one that I would be cautious with. And even going back to the previous point, perhaps this is a bit meta, but like in this whole concept of, do you burn your bridges or not? Like in both cases, I suppose what it comes down to is having a sense of confidence in your fallback plan. And the ultimate fallback plan is you, the person, right? And so if you have to burn your bridges, what you're basically saying, in other words, is once I cut ties with my current sort of way of being, I trust myself to figure it out. And the other version is saying, I trust myself to figure it out ahead of time, therefore I figured it out and now I'll go and do it. But ultimately, like the common denominator is you. And the more you can survive all of these little things, and perhaps even the reason why you find all these entrepreneurs who are successful multiple times over and who can figure it out is because they have that confidence because they've done it before. They've proven it to themselves. It's almost like the whole keystone habit idea where you flip one thing, you manage to find success in one area, and then all of these other areas which are seemingly unrelated, you start to find success also. And it's, again, the common denominator is you've proved it to yourself.
100%. And I think this relates to identity, because what so much of our society is about is relating our identity to our work. And if our work is a company that we work for, which is obviously not ours, we're ultimately not in control, because we're pawning off our agency and connecting our identity to something that is constructed, which is outside of us. The trust should actually be in yourself, because you got that job, you developed a certain skill, you can do that again in a different area, or you can do that somewhere else. And I think this is a problem for me, or it's a journey for me, maybe not a problem for me, but a journey, which again, during that sabbatical, this was 100% a realization that, am I too connected to my employer? And not just that, like, is my mental model too connected to what I previously have been doing in this job, and like I am restricting my own creativity in seeing, well, I got that job, and I got that job after developing a certain skill set. I can develop another skill set if I want to. If you don't even believe that, if you already start with the premise of, I've done this for such a long time, therefore I can only do that, you're already shooting yourself in the foot. This is the space which for me is really important, because this is empowering yourself. And this is, I think, where agency begins. Unfortunately, we already have like an education system which sort of gears you up for, it's talked about to death, but we have an education system which gears you up for the industrial revolution type work, right? Like working in a factory 9 to 5, etc., etc. You're the employee, just listen to what your manager says, because you don't want to screw up and cause the factory to burn down. So you have an education system which is teaching you to sit, shut up and listen and just absorb like that. The problem is that then you slowly stop thinking for yourself and stop being an independent thinker.
Our education system, I'm paraphrasing someone smarter here, but cranks out cogs for an economy that no longer wants cogs, especially in the West and in the kind of richest countries. And it is, the future belongs to the creatives, the creators, the freelancers, the independent thinkers. And I've written about this myself before too. There's this weird sort of thing where all of the people that they teach us to look up to in school, all of the heroes, all the people we have holidays for on the calendar or we celebrate, not a single one of them got there by sort of following the so-called default path. Like none of them were just like obedient students and then obedient workers who slowly climbed the corporate ladder and made their way to like CEO of the 200-year-old company after 50 years of working there. We're sort of prescribed that as the path to success, but there's this giant cognitive dissonance because none of the people we hold up as successful actually followed that path. I mean, you can spot the lie in the way that we teach people. And obviously there are, without getting too into conspiratorial thinking, like there are entrenched interest groups and incentives and everything for running the economy that way, for having people who are sort of obedient. And
if you find someone you admire, look at how they live. And the interesting thing is, if you look at whatever it is, like philosophers or entrepreneurs or etc. So, back to the Elon Musk example, look at how the person actually lives, because that tells you where their creativity, where their thinking is coming from. And interestingly enough, a lot of these people, you'll find they'll have some sort of a passion, which is where all of their creativity comes from, whether that's like walking in the woods or whether that's, Richard Branson, like adventure, like hot air balloons and going on these, crazy feats that actually inspire him and then lead to creativity. He lived on a flipping houseboat. Like he was such a misfit. He lived on a houseboat and refused to have, he refused to make his company public for such a long time, and refused to have like a board of directors so that he could be in complete control. A lot of these things, like, it's interesting because you might imagine that the best way to develop some of this knowledge is by just sitting and reading, but actually if you look at the people who've developed a lot of this knowledge and thinking, they're doing things in the world. They're just doing something or following their passions, And through that, they're being inspired and their thinking is developing. And then they're capturing that either through a product or through a writing. And that, I think, is a really, for me, that's helped. And this links back to why is it important for me to sort of just say, all right, I'm stuck. Now I need to go out for a 3-hour walk, even though I might potentially have like work I could sit at my desk and do. But I know I'll be far better and more effective at that work at my desk once I've had my 3-hour walk and thought through every. And this is, if I have a presentation or if I have some, meaty document I need to write, I simply will not develop that thinking sitting at my desk, looking at my screen. It just doesn't work like that for me. Which is interesting because it's so contrasting from the way our like education system works and the way that we think we're supposed to develop work.
No, and the worst part is we basically drug the kids who can't sit still. Like the would-be creatives, we drug them with Ritalin. And I don't want to shame people who need certain medications, but I just think that yes, we're sort of saying, first of all, like the important thing is that you sit still, shut up, don't interrupt the teacher, and learn this way. And if you can't do that, here's some medication to help you do it, rather than say, okay, well, like, is this method that we're prescribing actually useful for the results that we want or for the kids to have the best experience and so on.
I mean, don't get me wrong, that sit down, shut up thing worked for me. Like but it took me a long time to realize there's other ways as well.
Yeah, but it also, it's the usual question of what are you optimizing for? Like if you're grading people on obedience, then sure, being obedient is great. But if you're trying to write like a Nobel winning paper, maybe it didn't work, or maybe
you've got to break the norm in some way.
Yeah, and you mentioned Richard Branson. My mind went to Richard Feynman with his like drumming and later art and lock picking, and like he would play pranks on the other scientists during the Manhattan Project and all kinds of interesting things like that. He's certainly a fun one to study. I've made it a habit to study creativity and creative principles, and I think it's almost universal in everything that I've read from comedians like Jerry Seinfeld and John Cleese, Hemingway, and the great writers, and it's just like across the board. They all have a practice which is a mix of, sitting down and doing the hard work and not giving yourself excuses like inspiration hasn't hit yet. Really just having like a ritualistic practice of like, 3 hours a day, every day from this time to this time, I'm in this specific chair doing the work. And then also having that, like contrasting that with a varied and interesting life, away from their desk, outside of the chair, where they're, just having different experiences and knowing when they're stuck. David Perel he's got like a nice mnemonic for it, which is, I think, bed, bath, or bus when you're stuck. So either like, sleep on it, right? Bed, bath, the old hot shower or shower ideas or something like that, which in some ways is just changing your state. Or maybe there really is something magic about hot water. Either way, it seems to work for a lot of people. And then bus is sort of shorthand for like travel. Just get out and move, go somewhere different, like get out of the same physical space that you're in. So when it comes to creative work, changing things up.
A lot of that, all three of those, the way I see that, the connection that I see between all three of those is that essentially you're letting the thought process go from your conscious mind into your subconscious. And your subconscious mind is the place which is the synthesizer. It's the place which sees the connections. It has all the knowledge, but it will only bring it out when you're relaxed. Hence, showers. Showers are great because you go into the moment, and going into the moment means your conscious mind quietens and your subconscious mind is allowed to do its thing, and sleeping does this.
That is exactly how it works. David Ogilvy, the famous ad man, he's got a version of this. I mean, he's basically like, if you don't know who he is, he's like, if you've seen the TV show Mad Men, right? So like the quintessential kind of ad executive, and what they're doing is essentially problem solving, right? It is the almost like the purest form of creativity, where a client or somebody's coming to them and saying, look, we want to sell more soap or whatever, and they've got to figure out some clever way to do that, and that's the jingles and the commercials you see on TV or on billboards or in magazines. And so his process, which he's written about quite a bit, or he had written about quite a bit, was to stuff his mind with as much of the information as he could about the industry, about the product, like know more about that client and their bar of soap and every other bar of soap on the market than basically anyone in the world, and then unplug, learn all the stuff and then just walk away. And then at some point, whether it was overnight or the next day or sometime later, where his subconscious mind would synthesize, as you said, all of that together and come up with like, aha, this is the thing. And then he would have some seed of an ad. You still needed to work on it and refine the concept, but that generative bit where new stuff comes from was the subconscious mind. And
that is literally, that you've just described exactly how I work. That is literally how I work. I will do intense research and then leave it and then come back and do whatever I want in life, and then come back and I'll probably mind map a bunch of pages which pulls all that thinking together, and then from that I can produce what I want to produce, and that's far more effective, for me anyway.
I want to switch gears a little bit and go back to something we were talking about in the beginning. So we had a kind of extended conversation on this idea of the psychology of running out of money, saving up money, going to travel, taking time off, seeing the bank account balance go down. One option is, of course, to just deal with it, watch it go down, to zero even, and just like toughen yourself mentally to stick with that. Another option would be to turn around and run right back to your job. In your case, that was an option. I know it's not for everyone, but there's sort of a third path, which is to try to make some money on the side as you're going. And you hinted at the idea that you'd experimented with that. You mentioned coaching. I remember something about teaching yoga also. So what did you try and what did you learn from doing that?
So I tried a bunch of stuff. It was all quite related. It was all in the space of, let's call it, personal development, which covers yoga, meditation, but also like various exercises for self-awareness. Bear in mind, I had just come out of a couple of months of doing Vipassana plus yoga retreats plus sort of living in monasteries. I mean, that's always been something interesting to me. I also have always received a lot of feedback that people find that I am a good teacher and that I have patience. And so I thought, well, let me just put these together. And why don't I just try this out? It was more for fun. It started out more for fun. And I put together some workshops. So I ran a couple of workshops, like all-day workshops, about 5 or 6 hours long. And basically I just stuffed a lot of content into there. The aim of that was to sort of share some of the insights and experience that I've got from doing meditation and yoga and self-awareness exercises, like, introspecting on your values, for example. I mean, something that both of us do a lot. And I wanted to share the power of a lot of these things with others. One, because I simply enjoy it. Like, I love doing it. And I found quite quickly that I also love teaching it. The problem I had, and one of the reasons I stopped, which is quite ridiculous, was that I struggled to charge people for this, because, and I think this is something typical in the personal development space. Anybody who, people teaching or running things in the personal development space tend to be givers and tend to be doing it for the passion. And in yoga as well, I would say, kind of conflict around, oh, should I charge for this? And then you end up not charging enough, and then it becomes unsustainable. So yeah, I tested that out. I worked with it a bit. I enjoyed it. I ran a few of those. I iterated and developed them. And then I got to a point where I had this completely contradicting thing going on, which is that I had this mental struggle for myself, seeing my bank balance go down, needing to earn more money. And then on the other side, the thing I've sort of created during this time, I was not wanting to charge. I was probably not charging sufficiently to cover that. So there was this dilemma going on internally, which I struggled at that point to manage. And I think it was a fantastic experience, because you have to go through all of this yourself to sort of come up against your own mental obstacles. And both of these were two mental obstacles. One, not charging sufficiently on one side, or maybe even not giving enough value to convince myself that I can charge what I need to charge. And on the other hand, not feeling secure enough in my own position that I need to run towards some, further income in order to feel more secure. So both of those were my own mental blockers, which I was fascinated to encounter, because I didn't really know I would face these things.
Oh, that's such a good attitude, though. I love that. Fascinated to encounter my own mental blocks. I highly doubt, knowing you, that the challenge was you hadn't packed enough value into what you were doing. If anything, I would guess it was the opposite.
Yeah, it was a Tony Robbins kind of thing where the first session Tony Robbins did, he basically confused his audience because he shoved all of his knowledge into one session and people never came back.
I can understand why that would be, why, like how that can happen. I could see myself doing the same thing. I mean, it's some of these things too. It's like you focus on, one focuses on all the other challenges of going into business and you're finding customers and all that stuff. And you realize that actually like taking something that you know and sort of dripping it out in bite-sized chunks and not overwhelming the audience is perhaps the hardest part, right? Is you have so much that you want to say and all that. But that piece aside, going back to something you said earlier of like the way your identity becomes tied to the place that you work for. I think that's a huge piece of it also. It's something that I faced and something that's come up in conversation before where, previously when you work, like you basically had some negotiation with a boss or HR or somebody at one point to decide your salary and then, okay, that's sorted and now you just show up and do the work and maybe you have an annual review from time to time. But when you, as Vikram, are going out into the world and saying like, hi, please pay me, Vikram, for this thing, you have all sorts of like self-worth and imposter syndrome and who am I to be teaching this or selling this and asking them for money and all sorts of things like that come up. And I think that's, if you're selling like vault cleaning services to giant banks or something, right? Maybe it's easier to deal with that because you're like, oh, these big banks have all the money in the world and like I'm providing some service that they need and that's fine. But when you're selling like yoga classes to other perhaps young people who are early in their careers and they're just, it's a different target market. It's maybe a lot harder to say, oh, like this thing that I'm providing is valuable and I'm comfortable taking money for it and I'm the right person to teach it and they should give me money and all. It's so much easier to just say like, oh, hey guys, if you want to pay something, that'd be nice. Thanks. How did you resolve that? I mean, what did you make a sort of deliberate decision to say, I'll just keep doing all the yoga and meditation stuff for me on the side? I mean, you mentioned earlier something like not putting pressure on your passions. So was that, did you sort of just decide, okay, like this is something I enjoy doing, but I don't want to try to make money from it? Or where did you leave off in that whole internal discussion?
I think this is about time that we bring in the other thing that I started during this, which we haven't touched on at all as yet, which is Bounce Bhangra. And the reason I bring that up here is because I shifted my focus. I shifted my focus away from running these yoga workshops and self-awareness things. And I put that energy and also a fair amount of that content into something else, which we had already started earlier, but really picked it up after all of this. So that Bounce Bhangra, which I run with my brother, and we started it essentially. We conceptualized it before I took my sabbatical, but we conceptualized it essentially because of my sabbatical. Prior to the sabbatical, I was in this kind of mental limbo, affected by, as we talked about last time, my friend passing away and being away from family, etc. So talking to my brother about this, which he always is amazing at, pulling me out of these holes. And one of his first go-to solution is always go to the stuff that you have always enjoyed doing. So whether that's watching comedy, listening to music, or in our case, both of our case, dancing to Bhangra, which is a high energy North Indian folk dance. It's kind of evolved over time and merged a bit of hip hop and other modern styles. But essentially, it is this dance form which we've been doing since we were kids. And his solution was, hey, you're not feeling so great right now. You're going to be doing a sabbatical and you're going to have something to do in that sabbatical and you're going to have to put your energy somewhere. I'm a very high energy person. And if I'm working, so the point was that, I put a lot of my energy and creativity into my job. But if you remove that out now, and if I'm doing a sabbatical and I don't have something there, I have to create something. Otherwise, my energy stays inside and that goes into a dark place and that's obviously not helpful. So it has to go out into the world. So the way we did this, we sort of conceptualized that at this point, but we really kicked it off once I came back from my meditative travels. And essentially, we just, the story around this is itself kind of funny. Like I was debating back and forth how we should do this, what we should do. And my brother, completely out of his own character, spontaneously created a Facebook event saying, we're running this workshop, we're running this dance fitness class, and this is the day, this is the time, booked it, completely out of his character, but it worked really well because that gave me something to focus on. And so over the period of the sabbatical, we started running these sessions. And this is a whole other thing because this presented new challenges. The first session we ran, basically nobody came to. The second session we ran, only our very close, like our best friends came to because we asked them to. And then, by session 10, we were but the point was because nobody was coming. But we started this as a way to channel our energy into something we enjoy and to give me some sense of focus. Bear in mind, I still hadn't developed all of these ideas around running the yoga workshops and all of that. So the interesting thing was how that evolved as well, more and more. And I overcame the challenge of charging people money that was sufficient to cover the sessions and sufficient to cover what we needed much faster in the Bounce Bhangra dance cardio classes space than I was able to overcome that in the yoga self-awareness space. So because of that, it was...
What do you attribute that to? Like, what was it about Bounce that you found easier to charge for, or was it just because you had some practice at that point, or what was it?
I've been dancing since I was 10 years old, and I think I just felt more comfortable and confident as a teacher in that space, even though I received a lot of feedback that the yoga self-awareness workshops that I ran were extremely effective. I think personally it sat with me better, that I felt like it was a more tangible product that I could see. And I think the other thing is also just this sense of, this is maybe not true, and this is maybe just my own mental construct and blocker as well, but I think one of the things was that I saw that the purpose of the dance sessions was that you just have people come and enjoy themselves and uplift themselves. And you're not necessarily trying to pull people out of a hole or something like that. Whereas on the self-awareness side, my mental blocker here, I think, was that a lot of people are coming because they need help and they need support to help themselves through some difficult period in their life, for example. And I didn't necessarily feel comfortable charging them like an arm and a leg to be able to get that support. There's also a far more spiritual side to all of that, which I see having done Vipassana, which is entirely free and voluntary. It didn't sit with me very well that something which is essentially free and spiritual. Again, this is a belief system which I have evolved through over time as well. But at that point, for sure, I definitely felt like I shouldn't be charging much for this. It was almost like, that it's a belief that you put in your own mind that this is something sacred, I shouldn't be charging for this. Whereas Bhangra, I didn't see like that. I saw it as like, yes, this is something which is conveying high energy and I'm doing something here and therefore I can charge for that. But again, with the Bhangra classes, we started off charging something ridiculously low, like £3 per session. We would have needed like 2x the max capacity of the room to even break even on that thing. So very quickly, I think after about 3 or 4 sessions, that £3 or £4 went to £10. And by that point, it went to like £7 and then £10. And so it's interesting because that itself, the pricing was our own journey of getting comfortable with seeing our own value. This is why I think everybody should start something of their own. It doesn't have to be considered a business, but I think this is something that starting something of your own where you create something and you're trying to sell that in the world, it reflects so much of your own issues back to you that it's such a good process for people to go through.
Yeah, the entire conversation, if you were to extract a sort of meta narrative from this entire thing, it seems like most of what we study about business is numbers and strategy and all of this kind of stuff that, sure, it's important and it makes sense. And you and I both do it for a living in different ways. But when it comes to starting your own business and running a business, actually, so many of the potential hazards and avenues for success are like your own mindset. Like the thing that keeps coming up over and over again is you, the individual, the entrepreneur, the person who's doing it. And I'm sure the same is true in a different way for just a regular job. But as you said, once you start something, it really does reflect all of this back on you because, yeah, you're forced to go out and ask for money. You're forced to make decisions about like, do I feel comfortable charging for some spiritual service and other decisions like that? Something also I just want to highlight based on what you said. It's something that took me a long time to, I sort of learned this through books and, listening to other people, but I hadn't really internalized it. This idea of like scratching your own itch, where, it's sort of intuitive to do some kind of trends analysis, to realize that like crypto is cool right now and 3D virtual reality stuff is kind of like emerging finally, supposedly. And so maybe I should go develop like an Oculus app that lets you browse crypto prices in like a 3D world or some nonsense like that, right? Where you're just taking things that are like trendy and hot and where like lots of VCs are pouring money into it or whatever, right? But it has nothing to do with you as a person. It's just this sort of cold analysis of things that are likely to take off. And the problem with doing that is that everything is hard. It doesn't matter what you do. Everything is hard. And there's a high chance of failure no matter what you do. So right off the bat, if you're going to fail at something, you might as well fail at something that you enjoy doing. But that's sort of like a negative view on it. The less negative view is that in order to succeed, you have to stick with it, even when it looks like it might fail and when it's difficult. And so you went through the early Bounce sessions, and I remember this, where it's like, hey, 0 people showed up today, or only our friends came today, or, we're charging £3 per person and 4 people came. Yay, we almost covered the cost of lunch.
But not the cost of the venue that we had to hire to get those people to come to us.
Right. So like, yeah, we had a few people show up and we still were negative money. And every future session that we run until this gets better will be more negative money. So like our bank account balance is going down as we're trying to run this business. I thought people start businesses to make money. And like, we can joke about it now, but like these are real struggles that you face psychologically when you start something. And because Bounce for you served an additional purpose, like this was something that you loved doing and an outlet that you needed for your energy anyway. The stakes were not simply, if this makes money, it's a success. If this loses money, it's a failure. Like you had a vested interest in doing this and going regardless. Of course you wanted to be successful. Of course you wanted people to come. Of course you wanted to make money. And now obviously, for people who are listening who don't know, like you've won awards, you've been featured on the BBC, you've been, I think, partnered with Virgin Airlines, and like, it's blown up many orders of magnitude from those early days, but you would have never reached that level if you had quit at any point along the way. And quitting would be the obvious thing to do when 0 people are showing up, if you're totally dispassionate, and if it's just this, 3D crypto app where you're like, okay, I'm just going to create something that might be successful. And then if it's not successful, cool, I'll move on to the next thing.
I think it takes a very certain type of person, a very specific personality to sustain something that they have no interest in and are only doing it for making money in the business. There are definitely people who can do that, but it takes a very specific personality who is so determined to make it that it doesn't matter what they're doing. For everybody else, you can only sustain something you really are interested in. So you mentioned earlier infinite games, and Bounce Bhangra for me and my brother is essentially an infinite game. It's a game which you keep playing. It's a game which you're not playing to maximize your quarterly earnings or maximize how many people come this month or maximize how many awards I win this year. It's a game that we keep playing because it's something we fundamentally enjoy. Like I enjoy Bhangra and I enjoy teaching and I enjoy the sessions. So as long as I can physically do the sessions, I'll do the session. In the process, if we're making money, great. And that allows us to keep building it bigger and bigger. But it's essentially become a creative outlet for us and a way to share, again, a way to share our energy and the way we sort of translate, in this case, specifically the music and the energy and the culture of Bhangra and everything that surrounds that, into an empowering art form and message. So, I mean, it's something I'm fundamentally passionate about, that I'll just keep doing it anyway. And I think that's the way to go. So we sort of had a bit of a chat about this earlier, and you kind of had to remind me of the concept that I had previously shared with you. But again, a thing from Gary Vee, who I quote so much, I just think he's such a genius in the way he's broken so many of these things down, is you mentioned trends. Trends keep changing. And something that Gary Vee has shared a lot is we live in an age now with the internet where anything that anybody is interested in, you can find a whole group of people on the internet somewhere who is also interested in that thing. And what that means is that you can have a micro niche of something, and you could still potentially find like 1,000 people who are interested in that same micro niche. So if that's the case, and that micro niche, I mean, we had this example of like somebody who cultivates worms, for example, like such a random thing, but I'm sure that their person probably find like 1,000 people around the world on the internet somewhere who also loves to cultivate worms or cultivate like a specific type of worm. I mean, you can go so narrow into what the thing is. The point of this is that means you should no longer need to chase the hottest trend. In fact, if you just focus on what your fundamental interest is, at some point, the mainstream actually ends up picking up on that. Something may or may not become hot in the mainstream, but whether it does or not, you can probably still find those 1,000 people who can sustain your business in this area simply by following your own passion. And I think that is such a game changer in the scope of options and what's available to us compared to the generations before us. Like even when we were kids, this simply didn't exist. Like how much effort would it take to find the people who are interested in your micro niche? Well, you're pretty much stuck to the people in your specific locality. Because you'd have to go out and find these people. And then how do you find them? Cold calling, or like dropping flyers through, or putting ads in a newspaper. Like the way that we could communicate with people was so limited and so narrow that some of this stuff wasn't feasible. But because we are all now connected to this global network, which just keeps getting more and more efficient and connecting and bringing more and more people on, anybody can basically just pursue their own interest and find others who can do the same thing. And what that ultimately results in then is that you can have this cottage industry of thousands and thousands or millions of micro niches where you kind of go back to how things were pre-industrial revolution, where everybody was their own farmer, everybody was producing their own food, everybody had their own plot of land. You had the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, everybody was doing their own little thing. You didn't have this centralization of, you didn't have Amazon and all of these things because it just couldn't work like that. And we didn't have industrial processes and we didn't have concentration of capital. So everybody had to do their own version of their own thing. The benefit of that was that you have a sense of meaning in what you're doing because you're producing something and you're producing that thing from start to finish. So if you're producing a shoe, well, now, one person does the glue, one person does the stitching, one person does the design, and like nobody is actually seeing the whole product apart from maybe the strategy people who are not actually creating anything with their own hands. Whereas previously you've got the shoemaker does the entire thing start to finish. There's a certain satisfaction in that. The Industrial Revolution and basically made it so much more cost effective to just centralize all of that, split it, division of labor, have one massive company which does this for like the entire world, or like 5 or 20 instead of thousands and thousands. But now it's so interesting that we're coming kind of full circle where we potentially have this, we can have both now. We can have I can work for Shell, which is a massive centralized energy company which pulls in so many people. I work on a tiny little thing and somebody else works on another tiny thing. But separately, I can do Bounce Bhangra. And I can be one of thousands of people who teach Bhangra classes. I could make that big or I could make it small. It doesn't really matter. And I can find my following, my true 1,000 followers, and I can sustain a business there and satisfy myself. And if I really wanted to, able to do that full time, and etc.
That's you just see that was a beautiful weaving together of what were in my head a few separate narratives, right? Like the Kevin Kelly 1,000 True Fans idea and Gary Vee's that we kind of started with, which I'm very familiar with, and I think are sort of like the seeds of the creator economy that we're in now. And we talked earlier about the Industrial Revolution and just the way that education is still in that mindset. But I never really connected that back together, that what we're doing is going back to sort of like the individual kind of craftsman type economy. And then to your own story with Bounce, where it's like you get to do the thing that you're passionate about regardless. Now, kind of standard conventional wisdom at this point is start something and then grow it into a big business or grow it into a business that can pay you or sustain you. And instead, you're on this path where you have a job, you have security, you have all the good stuff that comes with that, and you still have the ability to do this thing that you're passionate about. Is that... And spoiler alert, like your sabbatical ended and you went back to Shell, right? That's the part that we haven't covered yet. So let's go there, right? Because we talked about the sabbatical, we talked about sort of the process of starting it and some of the struggles that you faced along the way, plus meditation and the retreats, and then some of the things that you explored from like business standpoint or just pursuing your own passions, and you ended up starting Bounce Bhangra during that time. So how do we get from there back to Shell? What was the conversation in your mind? Like you found this thing that you love doing, and yet you went back to work.
There were some things which pushed me back in and some things which pulled me back in. The things which pushed me back in, one of the main ones which we already talked about was money. And that struggle which I sort of slowly thought like, this is too much, like I haven't figured out how to manage this in my own head. And quite frankly, I guess impatient around that, and impatience with growing either the yoga self-awareness workshops or Bounce. So, and when I say impatience, I mean, if I had just focused on those, could I have faced the obstacles, gone through the obstacles and come out on the other side with a sustainable, profitable business which I could live off? Or could I have, for example, got it to a point where I could then take a business loan to sustain myself? I didn't think of any of that. I was in fear mode. So that was a major push thing. Fear mode, what happens when you go into like flight mode? So typically, like, you can't think. You cannot be creative in that process. So you fall back on what you already know. And what I already knew was Shell. I know that I can go back, and I know how it works. So that was a push. A pull was that just before I had taken the sabbatical, Shell was creating a new department which was called New Energy, essentially renewable energy and e-mobility, etc. So coming up to date with where the world needs to be. And for me, that actually was my passion. And it was actually initially one of the reasons I joined the company in the first place. Because again, for me, what drives me is empowering the world. And one of the fundamental ways, technological ways that I saw of empowering the world was sustainability and renewable energy. But when I joined Shell, they sort of didn't have much going on in that area. And I got a bit sidetracked, got interested in whatever else was going on. But I always had in the back of my mind that this is what I'm looking for. And so when I was taking my sabbatical, literally at the same time, Shell had announced that they are creating this new division. That was the pull side, that if I'm going back to Shell, that I want to go back in a place where I can find more meaning than I found before. And for me, that was this space. That's something then I started working on and was able to secure like a role in that space. And sort of that sort of made it, I'd say, made it palatable is probably too harsh, but I needed that change as well. And I had gone on this journey of meaning, and I needed to continue that journey of meaning. It wouldn't have sat well with me if I sort of just went back to what I was doing before, felt emptiness and felt like I wasn't progressing the world in some way. That wouldn't have worked, because I've already evolved and I'm on this journey of meaning, and I need to continue that. I see you smiling.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about like this kind of feeling of like going and doing yoga and all of this stuff and being on this path, and then going back to like giant oil company and just the sort of mental gymnastics you would need to play to sort of justify it to yourself. Because on the one hand, the money is nice, and on the other hand, it's like, yeah, there was all that stuff that sounded good. I wanted to pursue it, and I'll just put that in my pocket for now.
No, it's a very good point. So this is, I think, one of the other things that I faced prior to my sabbatical. I had been in Shell for 6 years or so. Everything I did was working on huge scale projects, things which once the project goes live, it's affecting hundreds of thousands, maybe thousands, hundreds of thousands or millions of people. Huge scale projects which have big impact, both positive and negative, because everything has two sides anyway. That was, again, another thing I struggled with in both Bounce and the yoga side, that my impact that I have in these sessions is far more direct. I can see the people in front of me, but the scale was minuscule compared to what I was used to. And again, all of this is why I think the balance of both works well for me at the moment still, is because it's kind of like I want to do it all, right? I want to do something where I have huge impact on the world and huge positive impact. And I get that through Shell. I can have a huge positive impact, especially where I am in renewables at the forefront of this space, which, I already see other innovations ahead of this now, but that satisfies that side. But the problem with that is I don't see direct impact. I'm not sitting and working with people. It's very amorphous. Like, yeah, we can build a wind farm, but I don't see the people who are benefiting from that. Like, it's far more abstract.
Yeah, especially with something like renewable energy. It's like carbon that wasn't burned, basically, is like the actual impact of it. So it's very intangible. You sort of know that like the world is better in some way, but yeah, I mean, not just because you happen to be sitting in an office in central London as opposed to like sitting in the wind farm. It's still just, yeah, it's abstract and intangible by nature.
Exactly. And on the other side, I have this like very small scale, not impacting a huge quantity of people, but the quality is there. And I am there, and there's a sense of presence. And quite literally, I can see the smiles on the people's faces, and I can see the change in them and their confidence levels when they get a certain thing, when they get a certain move, or when at the end of the session they're satisfied because they had a good workout. Like that itself, like I think, again, going kind of meta again, but I think humans are social creatures, and we live in a society now which is firstly quite virtual, and secondly it's very impersonal. We live in a very impersonal society where typically you would know the like 500 people in your village. Everybody knows everybody. There's a sense of trust there. Like, I think this is another reason why big companies still work, because in big companies you have that network. You can have that. Or any company really, but I think this is again the thing that's being reflected out in these two worlds that I've put myself in. That running the bounce session, I'm building a community, and we're kind of not replacing, but we're kind of being inspired by something which is fundamental to everybody, which is feeling that sense of belonging, knowing everybody, having those people around you, and connecting directly with them. It's a very different thing when somebody if you contact Bounce Bhangra customer service, you speak to me or my brother, and you know who we are because you come to our classes, and we're the ones who teach the classes. And I know who you are. I know what your name is. I know which classes you come to. I know what your level is. I know we know a lot about each other, and it's personal. If you have a problem with a wind farm that Shell has made, yeah, good luck trying to deal with that, right? Like, I mean, that's simply the structure. It's an impersonal structure, right? I think this is the thing, that the benefit of the impersonal structure is that it's impersonal not because it wants to be impersonal. It's impersonal because it's optimizing for efficiency and it's optimizing for scale. And that's good because that helps achieve something which you can't achieve at small scale. But it loses to some extent, to quite a large extent in some places. On the other side, we're optimizing in Bounce, we're optimizing for a high quality personal experience. That is why you come, because we give you this personal experience. We know what your name is. You can see us, etc. So
a few interesting things there. I mean, one, this comes up most often, I think, in the context of charity, where you get someone like, perhaps a controversial example, but let's say like Bill Gates, and his sort of de facto philosophy is, go out, work, do the thing that you're really great at in the world and get the world to pay you for that and make your, in his case, many billions of dollars. and then, kind of second mountain, second half of the career, go and donate a bunch of money. And even if it's not exactly that kind of linear of a progression, still the idea that like make your money doing the thing that's good at making money, which is sort of what you're doing at Shell, right? Like you have this skill set as an economist applied to energy, right? An area that the world spends a huge amount of money on. And so you're sort of making your money there. And then in a way, you're kind of using that freedom or whatever that buys you, the life that it buys you, to then go and do the thing that you're passionate about and have a community and have all of that. The charitable example would be you use that to donate the money. But then there's the counter argument for the charity side of it, which connects to what you're saying, which is like, yes, that's good, but part of the benefit of charity is actually seeing the faces of the people that you impact. And so if you're just like writing a check and never, going and building somebody a house and seeing their face or whatever, then it's a very different thing. And so it seems like in a way, you've sort of found a solution to that with this like kind of dual approach of having something corporate where there's scale and where there's money, and then having something that's like passion and it's still a business. You're not running a charity, but it doesn't have the same pressure that it would if you were, forced to extract making a living out of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's something that we've gone back and forth on with Bounce as well, where we wanted to be more aggressive on making it a business. And that actually hasn't worked quite a few times because because that starts to kill our creative outlet sometimes. And because we don't have to do that, by taking some of that pressure off, we can be more creative, be more experimental in that space. But coming back to what you were saying about charity, yeah, I think that's 100% correct, because there's a reason that charities use the face of a child in a developing country as opposed to just text, or as opposed to just saying, we're going to donate your money to some random selection of individuals out of the 10 million that we serve. Like, that doesn't mean anything to anybody. It's never going to encourage you to do anything. You have to show the face of a single individual, because then then we as the viewer start to develop a story around that. And why? Because that's how we develop stories. That's how we connect with people. We connect with them. I mean, even if you look at Shell's advertising, you will see like one person looking at a light bulb or something like that. Like it's a very different thing to put a picture of a wind farm or a solar farm. And that's great. Yes, we build technology, but nobody cares about the technology. You care about what the technology is doing for people. And obviously communication and advertising and marketing know everything about this. You mentioned Ogilvy earlier. Ogilvy, I mean, the company still exists, pretty bloody big, and they have courses as well. And one of the courses is applied behavioral science. And behavioral science is all about affecting psychology and knowing what makes people tick. And then, of course, in that context is used for marketing and advertising. And so much of this thing is about pulling the emotional strings in people. I mean, you could look at it as manipulation, but I mean, that's how we speak to each other. But that's also storytelling. That's also how films and books and novels work. And I think, and all of that. And so I think, again, coming back to what I was saying earlier, like we have this fundamental need to know people on a personal level. And I think for every individual, that balance between, well, in my case, impact at scale and for personal contact is going to be different. And there's probably other elements in there that you might want to optimize for. But I think for me, I know myself well that if I only did Bounce and didn't have something like Shell, which is impacting at scale, I would feel like I'm not fulfilling my potential because I'm doing something which is maybe too small. Now, maybe I can scale Bounce up, which satisfies that. On the other hand, if I was only doing Shell and I wasn't doing this, well, to be honest, one of the things that I specifically do in Shell is mentor people. Again, so this is not affecting people outside of the company, but within the company, I'm connecting with people and mentoring people within, so that I can, again, have that personal connection. I absolutely loved going and visiting like sites, i.e. industrial sites and factories and things like that earlier, because you meet the people in the factory. You meet the people who are building the thing that you're sitting there, me as the economist, I'm trying to like optimize their value creation process. But they're so bloody abstract. It's so much more interesting for me when I actually go to the factory and I meet those people. And although that person might only be there as like a manager or a factory worker for like a year or two, at least in my head, when I'm sitting there doing my Excel spreadsheets, I know like, okay, I am actually helping this guy, Peter or whatever, to do his job better, etc. So I think there's so many ways that achieve these things, and that's, I think, more the takeaway that maybe I want to share in this is that, yeah, I found a way of doing this for myself, but I think it's the starting point is self-awareness, and you need to do stuff in the world to have reflected back to you what you are and what you want. And then once you know that, then you can shape the world and shape whatever the hell you're doing in a way that gives you what you're looking for. This is Steve Jobs' whole quote around, if you poke the box of life, you will find that it bends to you. And I'm paraphrasing, but you can poke the box and shape the box in a way. You know, the moment you realize that if you see a gap in the world and you can, you don't need permission to do something about that. You can just do something about that and people will follow it. I don't have qualifications in teaching dance, right? But I am a dancer and I've been dancing for 25 years. So I use that as the basis to give me the confidence to go and teach. Yeah, I've done a lot of yoga. I've done a lot of personal training, like in the gym. I've picked up a lot of that. I have experience there, but yeah, somebody who's running a business doesn't need to have a qualification in business to run a business.
It's almost an anti-qualification in some ways. I was sitting here trying to think of some pithy way to end it, to summarize our conversation, but I think you've done it beautifully. And you mentioned applied behavioral science. I mean, to me, that's what all of this is, right? It's applied behavioral science on yourself. As you said, it all starts with self-awareness, just going out there, trying stuff, doing stuff, seeing not only how the world reacts, but how you personally react, learning something from that, and then adjusting and trying again and doing more. So thank you, Vikram, for joining me again.
Thank you. It's always fun.